little bit on less is more. And if you've listened to all my other videos so far, you've already heard me start to acknowledge this. So, graphic design basics, formal elements of 2D design. There's line, shape. Here's line and shape. Notice how the shape of the girl's arms and their dresses create this, the bird in the middle. Again, similar kind of concept. Sorry about that. The neckline of each person kind of insinuate that's a female and a male, possibly. Creates a heart. And then also notice this cross that they've gotten in here. Oh, and it's Romeo and Juliet. So star-crossed lovers with kind of their like mouths and chins, and how that creates two visuals between them and then this cross and heart. Peter and the Wolf, beautiful visual, beautiful illustration of this wolf, and then you can pretty clearly see this little boy's profile in the shape of just the body and tail of this wolf. Same thing as kind of the negative space of this gun forming a face, and then all you really needed was this kind of eye and eyebrow, and you've really got a face. Great visual. I love this with these two like violins and just a bow tie, and how that bow tie represents formality. And this negative space between the two violins sort of gives us the representation of a neck and ears of a person when you put this bow tie on it. Without the bow tie, I don't know that you would see a person by any means. The bow tie really solidifies this is a neckline of somebody. MCC, what SCF used to be called, Mancy Community College. The negative space of this inner C carved out of the first M and the second C. And then some of this, the second C bleeding into the negative space of this C. You know, such an interesting visual. Sort of like a key, the key to your education. Okay, so line and shape, we've commented on both those. Then color. Hue, the hue of a color, the value of a color. So the color name, hue, the value, the range of lightness. I call this shade and hue. Value, like how much black is inside, how much black shading is inside a particular color. And then the hue, how saturated is it? So here's just a basic grayscale. How much black and white. You can see the contrast, color contrast in here, and how much more this guy pops for us. Very similar here with this image. Two different colors and what they mean. You know, really think about why do these colors work together. And if you look at them in the hues of colors, they're at a similar value. They're at a similar value. You know, one of them doesn't have more black in it. If this blue side had more black in it, it'd look more navy, and it wouldn't look like it was such a similar color value to this kind of limey green. And when you use them on top of each other, if you blur your eyes at this statement right here, it becomes very difficult to read. So the contrast is really lost. I'm going to go over that in a few more minutes in more detail, but the contrast is not high enough. One of them does need more contrast, meaning more black and white, kind of like how these photos have their contrast strengthened in the right side. So back to the example of putting more black in the blue, it would become more of a navy, and then this lime green would pop on it more. Or the opposite way, adding some more black to that limey green, and then it becomes more of a forest green, and you can visually see it a lot more. It has a lot more contrast in it. Saturation, how intense is the color? Oh, hue is more like, yellow, red, orange. Value I call shade, so the range of darkness that's into that hue. Saturation, how intense is the color? So obviously this red is much more saturated than this red. And those things play a part in the mood you're trying to create. Texture, like actual texture, physical texture on something. The surface of this clay jar consists of rows of pointy bumps, so it's actually feels rough on the hand. That's a purposeful texture on that element. Oh, embossing. So nice. And what does that texture do for your typography in a printed piece of work? Embossing has nothing necessarily to do with digital work, although it's a beautiful visual. And what does that visual mean if you're not actually physically printing it, embossing into it? The illusion of texture. Okay, that was kind of where I was going with that last example. You can give the illusion of texture and it still gives you some coolness. The actual surface of the sculpture is hard, cold, and smooth. It's made of marble. Crazy that is marble. Okay, we've got, kind of like a leave behind of the Ford Mustang with visuals of it. And what does that entail? How saturated is the coloring? How vibrant is the coloring to make you feel really alive in this very racy car? The Buccaneers want you. I think color contrast gets pretty difficult with this red and a dark shadow. If you blur your eyes, it's very hard to see those words. Oh, but it was kind of talking about the illusion of texture. You can add the illusion of texture. Was it done perfectly here? Probably not. Okay, so there's actual texture and there's illusion of texture. And you can have a say in both. All right, principles. So those are your formal elements of 2D design. Line, shape, color, texture. Principles of design. You've got format, balance. Is one side very heavy? Is one side very light? Does one side feel like it's falling off the page? These are all feelings that you'll get based on the technicalities of how you lay something out. So, symmetrical, meaning exactly the same on both sides, or asymmetrical, meaning not quite the same on both sides. It's good to understand both of these. They both work. This is not saying one is good and one is bad. This is just saying understand them. Sometimes you'll use one and sometimes you'll use the other. Balance can be achieved symmetrically or asymmetrically, like I just told you. Or balance can be achieved symmetrically or asymmetrically. So, you read through this statement, whether it's centered above each other, and I like how the biggest words have just the or in between because you're really drawn into symmetrical or asymmetrical. Or this is kind of interesting with, balance, and then balance. You feel a little bit more teeter-tottery, which is kind of interesting. Very interesting. So this one uses that kind of asymmetrical look. Everything's very centered. That's cool. This one uses, and did I say asymmetrical? This one uses a symmetrical. This one uses a little asymmetrical. Interesting. I'd love to see like part of that globe like right here. It'd be such an interesting visual. And if it aligned up with kind of this and this, it'd be very pretty. Okay. This is an interesting way to talk about hierarchy, but the arrangement of elements according to emphasis, beginning with the focal point. So your hierarchy, your focal point should be your main thing that you see. So on this guy, it would have probably been the headline, and then I'd go in and read. It's different for everything, but that's a really important concept to understand now and to continue to push yourself to understand better and better and better as you continue possibly in this profession. a visual way of showing first place is clearly the largest, second is the second to largest, and third is very small. So visually, and you also have the most contrast and color on the word first. It's physically biggest and most vibrant and contrasty, whereas this one's a little less and then even less. Okay, so like where are you looking? You're kind of looking at this sign. It's got the highest degree of contrast with this brightness. It's right in the middle. It draws you in and kind of drives you back into space of this piece. This is a great redo. So I think this shows you like, a way to do it and a better way to possibly do it. So when you look over here, yes, you see the 100th Street. You'll hear me again, if you take some of my other classes here, a lot of my concept of small, medium, large. I think that 30 to 50% of your image should be something large. Large and impacting. That's your hierarchy. You're one big, large, impacting something. I'm not going to say a picture because it can be type. In this example, I would kind of read, this headline is one large impacting. It's about 30%. If you broke this up into 3 pieces, it's about 30%. And it's really big and bold, which I really like. Yeah, this is also 30%. But it's just, everything's a little bit kind of medium. The type is not huge. It's not that much bigger than the We Did It. So hierarchy-wise, it's sort of, the We Did It competes almost with the header, whereas in this one, the 100th Street is clearly bigger, significantly bigger than another successful block party. And I understand this starts to get into some gray area, and you're just going to have to push and push and push yourself for this. So one large, I do usually a couple of medium. So to me on this guide, this is medium, this is medium, this is medium. And then everything else is small. This is all small to me. To me, everything over here is small and then kind of medium. So it doesn't really have that like one large impacting. Even this little blob of color is pretty cool. This really shows you the flow. So these are the same. But you can see how visually, in theory, you're sort of drawn in here. It's your largest impacting through this large impacting image that dumps you down into this text where a little medium keeps drawing you down, and then by then you're drawn in for all this little text. That's kind of what this is showing. A large shape is heavier in comparison to a small shape. Yeah, heavier. Like, I think that's a pretty easy concept to grasp. A darker shape is often heavier than a lighter colored shape. So more contrast, more darks and blacks often make something more heavy. And I say often because it depends on the context of the whole thing. If everything is black, like that image of the back alley above, or earlier, then everything's black and it's not one black image, just everything's black. So then the light image pops. So context is a big piece of it, but in theory, black holds more. Patterns, textures or patterns are typically visually heavier than just a solid color. I think that makes sense. Like physically heavier, your eyes a little heavier to read that. So keep that in mind. Dull tones are lightweight, bright tones are heavy. So that red is much heavier in theory. And you don't have everything heavy. You don't have everything red and black. Ooh, your eye would have nowhere to rest. It just all feels so heavy. And you want to have a good balance. Remember, balance is huge. And these are some things to really keep in mind with you want to grasp these concepts. You want them to start to become second nature. You want to see something bigger and think of it as heavier. You want to see something more darker contrast and think of it as heavier. You want to see something more patterned and crazy and think heavier, so that you're realizing, okay, everything's heavy. I need to lighten something, or only this one little thing is heavy and that's really good. It has great balance. So I think this does a really interesting concept. We flow naturally right here. And we do that because literally they've got this glass that sort of poured this out. But what they've also done that you might not realize is instead of having these shoes maybe face up, so if these two shoes faced up and you were drawn in, your eye might then circle right back out without reading everything. So pointing even these shoes into what we're hoping you read is just another way of that visual hierarchy and really commanding and controlling the visual hierarchy of your piece. So same kind of thing. One a day keeps the doctor away. And which one do you kind of feel is the best visually? I mean, I might say this one's the most balanced. This one feels very heavy. This one feels very heavy. This one feels really tight and heavy. Maybe this guy. And some may say, well, that's the most boring one. But, I don't know. In comparison, in relation to the others, it's the most kind of easy one to make your way through. Okay, this layout shows you kind of that small, medium, large. I would consider this almost large. It is physically pushing the text out. Yes, the text may be a little bit smaller, but it's sort of reading as like a nameplate, a plaque. Kind of reads as large. Then you've got these kind of mediums, and then all your small. I wish that maybe your large was the one that had the more darks in it. Maybe if it was a dark black plate with this looking like it was embossed out of it. I don't know. This visual kind of pulls me actually over, and there's a kind of a strange balance. Do you notice that? Your eye wants to go here, but like you think you're supposed to look here, and then you want to go here. So I'll go there. So think about that. Cracking performance, and it's hard to read. Just the small text. Red is a really difficult color to successfully do in graphic design. So the fact that they've kind of done this little piece of typography and they have it running off the page, because it's so large, definitely 50%. It works. And even this word performance sort of pulled up into it. We really read that, and then we go try to investigate more, which is telling that story and drawing us in. One large impacting, and then kind of medium and small. That one large impacting is so interesting to look at. Before, things are everywhere, kind of overlapping, or after, where we really see them all, and we've pushed the contrast so that our images that have sort of a dull tone are not set on a dull background. Same blue, just more black in it, so it makes more contrast for the colors that are a little more dull and lets them pop on the background. Principles of design. You've got format, you've got balance, we've gone over that, visual hierarchy, the arrangement of things so that they bring your eye in, and repetition. Repeat things. You've got these swoosh, these little waves, those are repeated. You want to continue those things. You've got these vertical lines from your cover to your inserts. Your typography gets repeated. Even the coloring of some of your typography gets repeated. Unity, do they all work together? Interesting, this concert series and it kind of coming out of this very contrasty graphic. Minimalism is not a lack of something. It's simply the perfect amount of something. I think that's really good to understand because, again, as you've heard me say, there's often going to be clients that are like, oh, fill this space. It feels empty. And you got to listen, and maybe sometimes it really is empty, but sometimes it's the breathing room. And you need to say to a client that you never want to argue with them. And sometimes I just fill it. And it's not always the best design that I want, but they're paying. But technically speaking, you want room to breathe around a piece. And you don't want every little inch to be crowded with stuff. Here's a good example of sort of simplifying. Did it need all this? Frequently clients would ask for something more like this. Let's add some swirlies and a few more. Can we do a different font with this or that? And what about a fun border? Okay. But we could also do this with the simplified. See, there's still a little bit of that colored border. Simplified of that look, and then just simple. And now look how your eye really sees the mountains and the trees. Whereas with here, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to this spiral almost immediately. And I'm going to the word in. When actually the word autumn and Isle Royale is the important word, not the word thick, bright in. So thinking about that. Contrast. So this is where you're going to hear the word crap a lot. Contrast is what C stands for. Contrast can be with size. It can be with weight. It can be with color. Here's some major contrast of a very dark, almost black purple, and a very bright green. Here's a lack of contrast. You have no idea what this bumper sticker is even saying. It can be spacing. Is this very airy versus very not airy? Still really pretty. Spacing with how this pops behind it and goes back up. The contrast is very interesting. Contrast in text. You've got this very heavy serif text and then this very kind of calligraphy text. Okay, so contrast can be a lot of things. Color, all kinds of things. Repetition. Remember, we're going to spell out crap. See R. R is for repetition. Are you repeating elements? Don't make something cool and then try to do a whole brand new cool thing on the next page. No. I've heard in my classes when we're doing something where you do an additional element for it and they're like, oh, well, that seemed too easy. Well, yeah, once you've designed it once, it should get easier to bring it over to your other pages and keep implementing it. Should feel easier. This red. So it's not an element, but it's a color. So you're repeating the red. Oh, I love that. And it also sort of sandwiches it in, like it's the furthest and the furthest. Okay, remember crap. A, alignment. Are things aligned? Do you have them aligned? Or are they just literally like a quilt all over the place? You can see this alignment. You can set up true guides. And like even from the word teller in the header down to the page, like to have that aligned is such a beautiful little moment of keeping this margin the same. This has alignment, although I'll point something out in terms of alignment and margins, which I think of margins a lot with alignment or padding, kind of the same thing, same concept. See how narrow this padding margin is and how big that is? That's not a lot of repetition. And then this one's a whole third size. So you've got like thin, medium, wide. I want to have the same. Even the leading, kind of possibly want it to be the same. Not always, something similar. Love to see little dots maybe brought in a little somewhere else. Just throwing that out there. Alignment, like look at that. That's beautiful. And then all the work that goes into getting these to work perfectly and perfectly. It's some really nice alignment. This amount of padding is almost exactly the same as this amount of padding as this amount of padding as this amount of padding. Like that's really nicely done. Here's another example. I'm not a huge fan of that typography, but okay. I'm not a huge fan of the contrast in this. See how this green gets really lost on this background. So we've already discussed a few different ways you could improve that. Okay, proximity. C-R-A-P. Proximity. It's kind of maybe also a little bit of the padding. So just see how the left side, it's so tight. Oh, it makes me cringe. And then the right side's really wide, and then this side's medium, and this side's really ridiculously wide. Like, that's crazy. And then the flip side of it. Okay, so this is the same content, broken up, better, but still not centered, which is a little funky, but definitely easier to read by breaking up some of these big blocks of content, text. Okay, see it how heavy it all the same. Kind of boring in a way. Whereas over here now you've really like header, subheader, and then broke them up into manageable bites instead of trying to hand them a big giant bite and say, take it all. You're like, here, I'll break it up into 4, and then it's really easy for you to get. Good contrast, although this gets a little bit more lost. But see this nice alignment all along the side? Proximity is nice. It's pushed off. Everything has room to breathe. Try to avoid centering everything. Your layout kind of looks like a wedding invitation. I agree. I think sometimes it can work and sometimes it doesn't. Probably the easiest is a left justified. We're used to reading left to right. It's what our mind is kind of used to. And it flows well. Beautiful. Big, impacting, piece of typography. Everything's aligned. There's good contrast with this red. Even on this scripted gray, it's still very easy to read, breathless. It repeats like this script in this script. It repeats this gray and this gray. The alignment is nicely done all the way down. And then the proximity, and some maybe like, fill this space. Oh, it's just beautifully done. It doesn't need that space. You want literally room to breathe with this guy. Contrast, yep. Alignment, proximity, repetition was all in there. Lots of fonts. Don't put too many fonts. Don't be crazy. I call these stylized fonts that are really stylized. They're not just like a bold or a thin or a scripted. They're like really stylized. Be really careful. It's like maybe one. Maybe one of those should be used in a piece. Never two. I guess I'll say almost never two, but probably never two for any student. You'd really have to be an expert to make 2 very stylized fonts work in one single piece. So here it does work. See how they've only used it one time? Capital letters, you got to be careful. I use them a lot. Sometimes it could get more difficult to read in body copy. Caps versus lower. The shape of a lowercase word is created by ascenders and descenders. So ascenders and descenders, which can change like the white space around text versus when it's in all caps. So you can see how this shape is very different than if all these were caps, it would just be a long rectangle. Here's the long rectangle. There's the long rectangle. 2 different shapes. This is a great visual of how different uppercase versus lower or cap sensitive is. Like how different. I often like all uppercase. Pull quotes. We call these, you'll often hear them called as call-outs. So pull little quotes, little tidbits. Now listen, this is way too close. They're way too close. It's making me cringe because they need to be have more room to breathe around them, and they're suffocating. But the point of having these quotes is really good. And it draws someone in to the rest of the text. Oh, yeah, the page does look crowded. Shrink down some of your body copy. Rule of thumb, point sizes range from about 8 to 12 for body copy. So 8-point font to 12. 8's really small. So if your target audience is senior citizens with some AARP advertisement, 8-point font is not going to work. Okay? Think about that. Narrow margins, meaning like, it is so tight. Oh, breathe. Oh, bless. Doesn't that just feel better? And yeah, you have to rearrange a lot. They shrunk down the overall text, so this text is smaller. And then they gave everything so much more room to breathe. They also simplified this font. It's still kind of scripted in italic a little bit, but it's not as crazy as the other one, and it just flows. Look, boom, boom, boom. And if these quotes are interesting enough, I want to read it all. Great job. Oh, and here's a great comparison of the two. Oh, it's just so much nicer. Space. Give them space to breathe. Okay, what's wrong? Well, too many fonts. Oh, gripes. Yeah, check out the footer. It's got a whole nother one. It's redundant information. The by Stephen 3 different times is just, it's annoying to an audience. And the layout is too top heavy. So everything's up here and you just want to like tip over to the left. Woo! How could it be rearranged? Photographs by Stephen, and then they each get their own name and you flow nicely. And there's still a little graphical element because they just wanted more interest with those lines. That's neither here nor there. How do these two compare? Typography wise, I actually don't mind this one. I wish it, well, I don't like how Little Feet is so much bigger and then these are just totally different. But I do wish maybe some more typography had happened with this guy. If I'm nitpicking. Never do this. Never. Place type over a photograph. It makes it extremely difficult to read. And you can't look at the photo. So you're not reading words or looking at a photo with this guy. Same. But it can be saved because it's got so much less going on. Like this picture is just crazy. There's black, there's white, there's visuals and another visual and then these tree and there's just so much going on. Absolutely not. This guy, pretty simple. Could it be salvaged? Yes. It's still a little hard up here. A little funky, but it can be saved. Yes. And you can see these two next to each other. Nice. Oh, someone's going to clean my teeth. So all centered, slightly boring, everything's a little medium. Asymmetrical kind of reads as a large, although I almost want this big black moment to be the large, medium, and then smaller or smaller. A little bit more in that small, medium, and large. Whereas this one, like, everything's kind of the same. Even this guy and this guy are just way too close. You know, you want to have a difference in what you would call your body versus your header. I hope that gives you a lot of information on graphic design and crap. Contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. That's super important for this class and anything in the design world and art world. Great concepts to use across the board and anything creative that you may do. Let me know if you have any questions.